Welcome everyone, both near and far. My name is Andrew Torrance, and today I have the privilege of chairing the fourth of Professor Oliver O'Donovan's Gifford lectures on the theme, The Disappearance of Ethics. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, this series of lectures is being divided into two parts. In the first three lectures, Professor O'Donovan has focused on how ethics disappears when we miss out on three things. First, the object, which is the good. Second, the frontier, which is time. And third, the agent, who is the person. In each of these lectures, we have not only heard about what is lost, but we have also been given some insight into what is to be gained when these things move to the forefront of our minds, particularly when these things are construed theologically. So for those of us who have listened to these first three lectures, we have now truly been drawn to the edge of our seats. And now in these final three lectures, we are very much looking forward to hearing about a constructive way forward, to hearing about a way to and for recovery. Now, before I hand over to Professor O'Donovan, there are a couple of points of housekeeping. So first, following the lecture, there's going to be a chance for Q&A. At that time, there will be a Q&A chat function that opens up where you'll be able to post your questions. We'd ask that you would be able to try to keep your questions concise and to the point. And also, Professor O'Donovan asks that if you're known to him, that you put your name with your question. And then we will sort out and I will read out these questions. And unfortunately, it is likely that we're not going to be able to have time to get through all of the questions. We ask that you still ask them. I should also note that there will be a transcript of all the questions made available to Professor O'Donovan after the lecture, and so Professor O'Donovan will very much appreciate your feedback. The second point of housekeeping relates to time change. So in the UK, daylight saving time ended on October 31st, and I think most of America ends it this weekend, meaning that the time difference for next week's lecture will not be the same as it is today. And this is going to differ in other jurisdictions, so just please keep an eye on that. But for now, it is my tremendous privilege to hand over to Professor O'Donovan to give his lecture on creation and the recovery of reality.
Thank you very much, Andrew. In the first lecture, we took our departure from Kant's attempt to drive a wedge between natural goods and a rational good of action. That was his response to the early modern idea of nature as a complex of interlocking regularities. Early modern nature is blind to the concrete and to the new. The being of things loses concrete subsistence, swallowed up in replicable kinds. The time of things loses its eventfulness and becomes a display of regularities. In nature's realm, nothing happens that does not display conformity. There's a useful and rather charming German proverb, einmal ist keinmal. Once is never. An event conforming to no law is a non-event. But nature is also blind to the good, which loses its sovereignty over evil. In nature's realm, good and evil appear together as complementary aspects of a circular process. If vegetables are good for animals as food, animals are good for bacteria as habitats, bacteria are good for vegetables as environmental conditioners. It's also true that bacteria make animals die, animals are predators on vegetables, and vegetables constrain the reproductive success of bacteria. So by traveling around the circle, one way we describe a circle of goods, by traveling around the circle, the other way we describe a circle of evils. Goods and evils are mutually interchangeable. That is the hallmark of the natural system. Nothing in nature tells us that animal health is more important than the reproductive success of a virus. More complex, certainly, but not necessarily better or higher. Nature has no place for the better and the higher, for the good we ought to prefer. But once upon a time, there was a more genial concept of nature, and it prevailed in the classical world, which was not blind to the concrete, the new, or the good. Nature was physis, or growth. It was morally normative because of the irreversible direction of organic growth. So blindness to being, time, and the good was not a feature of physis, but of tuche, or chance. When the early modern conception of nature entered civilization, the older conception did not simply go away, but went, as it were, into the background. The official histories of Western ideas, based on a canon of texts, always tend to underestimate the capacity of a human culture to support alternative outlooks at the same time in tension. Yet even they notice a revival of the older normative ideas of nature in the 18th and 19th centuries. It inspired Goethe, Wordsworth, the early Romantics. My grandmother would have said of the inhabitants of an unfriendly neighborhood in her city of Cork that they had no nature, a value-rich use of the term that would, I think, have been understood by Seneca. And the older concept has surfaced again in recent years in our ecological and biotechnical debates. It's less unusual today than it was 30 years ago to hear it said that nature lays a moral claim upon us. Indeed, it has been claimed by so usually insightful a commentator as Gerald McKenny that the older concept of nature is what dictates my own occasional intervention on bioethics questions. Well, I have to plead not guilty, or perhaps I should be pleading not innocent, but I do so a little reluctantly, as I do not want to undervalue the older concept of nature. Given the gravity of these biotechnical and environmental concerns, it would be simply too facile to fall back on the official histories of Western ideas and say, well, nature as you describe it no longer is thought, because it plainly is thought. If these concerns are expressed in the language of a normative nature, there may be reasons to look for a better language, but still the urgency of the concerns remains what it was. Yet, in the last analysis, I have to agree with McKenny that nature as growth is not a stable foundation for moral thought. And the reason is that it adopts the perspective of the living organism itself with its spontaneous interest in living. The observer's view, detached from that spontaneous interest, gives fuller weight to the place of death, decay, recycling in the natural system. And those things cannot simply be avoided. So, for most scientific purposes, it is still the modern idea of a value-free nature that sets the agenda. Philosophy, once it was faced with the observer's view, could not simply go on thinking of itself as natural philosophy. It needed a place to stand outside nature, a place which Kant called freedom. It also needed to find a place for the irreversible logic of unique events, history. From these two needs, there arose the sharp opposition of practical and theoretical reason that idealism bequeathed its successors. And to get behind that opposition, to reintegrate nature, history, and freedom, we need strong additional reasons to believe that our preference for living rather than dying is more than simply a wishful projection of our own energies. We need something besides nature. We need a history that fulfills nature by vindicating life. And without this, even the most far-sighted ecological concerns are bound to become bogged down by the irresistible facticity of our human impact on the earth. The idea of living harmoniously with nature is as difficult to give substance to today as it has ever been. And to give it that substance, we need to know more than either Newton or Goethe could teach us. And at this point, theology has a contribution to make with the concept of creation, a theme of central importance to Jewish and Christian faith with obvious bearing on modern vacillations about nature. There have been times within the history of theology that it has not seemed so very important to articulate the idea of creation over against the classical idea of nature. So closely did the two seem to interlock and support one another. But at other times, and especially in recent decades, theologians have felt the need to describe more carefully the logic of faith in creation. That logic is that act precedes being. Creation is a noun of action. It describes something someone does. The late Christoph Schwebel, whose recent loss is so painfully felt in St. Andrews, summed it up like this: there is nothing given for the creative act of God. In the beginning was the divine act. Barth called it the Wohltat in his magnificent exploration of creation in the Church Dogmatics. In the hands of his translators, that German word becomes benefit. But that, I think, throws too much weight on good effects rather than pointing us back to the priority of the good enacted. This is a good deed, the conferral of being on what is not by the one who is what he is. There are two introductory comments to make on this before exploring that theme in some greater detail. First of all, to act is to envisage a good as concretely determined at a point of time and to realize that good. Being, good, and time are inseparable in action. Though there are some exertions that do not satisfy that description but may still be called acts, we speak of acts of wanton destruction, for example. We may generally describe such bad acts as failures to realize what action really is. Failure is a term reserved specifically for would-be acts. There are no failed anythings except acts. In the act that made possible all other acts, the threefold chord of being, good, and time is unbroken. The act of creation is necessarily good by virtue of being real in itself and effective in time. To call it a good deed, therefore, is strictly redundant because as a deed it must be good, but the redundancy is useful because it draws our attention to the connection between action and the good. It protects an adequate conception of action against an inadequate one. In God's good deed, his Wohltat, we hear an echo of Goethe's most quoted line, Am Anfang war der Tat. In the beginning was the deed, which was, you recall, Faust's notorious correction to the opening words of St. John's Gospel. Faust's deed was rebellion, a rebellion against reflection and a rebellion against worship, and as such was a failed deed. Unanchored and disoriented activity, supposedly typical of the modern subject, loses its being and its good, and hence loses its time also. But action in the beginning has these three dimensions of reality in itself. So, secondly, we can say that the doctrine of creation can be taken as a critique of a metaphysics. Let me explain what I mean by that. If by metaphysics we mean loosely any attempt to look behind phenomena to observe deeper structures of reality that give them form and significance, then a great deal of our thought is metaphysics, because thought pursues the inevitable ambition to organize experience comprehensively. But metaphysics may be meant in a narrower sense as taking the further step of interpreting these deeper structures as a kind of explanation of experience. Now, explanations, by definition, simplify. That's what an explanation is, a simplification. They eliminate what is not essential to our understanding. So if metaphysics is led by a desire to explain, it will become another type of reduction, no longer comprehensive. Reduction is a technique proper to specialist thinking with specialist questions. Now, metaphysics has often looked reductive. The many are reduced to one. Being, time, and the good are reduced to regular occurrence. Reality is reduced to sensory experience. It's explanatory ventures like these that have given steam to the 20th century project of overcoming metaphysics, seeing it as a sophisticated attempt to ignore or forget important dimensions of experience. Well, overcoming metaphysics was a program easier to announce than to give direction to, but one thing it did suggest was a requirement always to account for what is suppressed in an explanatory scheme, to be on guard against forgetfulness induced by theoretical success. There are obvious ways in which the modern concept of nature is metaphysical in the sense of forgetting things. It forgets what Kant knew, that the knowing mind is also the acting mind, and that a logic of regular occurrence does not suffice to guide action. It forgets what Hegel knew, that the observable regularities of the natural world do not account for the uniqueness of historical events. And it forgets what Heidegger knew, that they do not account for the world of existence, framed by unsubstitutable horizons. So the piety of early modern Europe, which often looked for a theological endorsement of modern nature, distorted the doctrine of creation. In the beginning, God, it said, taking everything back to a single primitive reality. But what the ancient priestly narrative wrote was, in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth, taking everything back to an original complexity. Creation affirms complexity back at the beginning, in the act that unifies being, time, and good. So let us explore this threefold chord of being, time, and good by examining in turn its three pairs. First, there is the unity of being and time. The being of the world, realized by God's dynamic act. The creation of the world, if we're to talk about it at all, has to be talked about in narrative. Only secondarily and derivatively can we then form theoretical propositions about it. Narrative is not governed by the metaphysical need to simplify, to find a root cause, or to describe an underlying form. Though, of course, we may fashion narratives in the service of any of these uses, but what narrative does of itself is to make time original to the relations that constitute the world. The words "in the beginning," with which the ancient Hebrew narrative opens, point to a temporal character of the appearance of being, and to a continuity in time of all appearance of being. They warn us against looking behind time to a timeless ontological or teleological foundation, since time is an essential condition of the world we inhabit, but was correct to insist in some sense on the temporality of creation, to resist short-sighted theological attempts to present creation as a permanent relation of dependence of secondary beings on primary being. Yet a narrative cannot tell of a beginning unless it also tells what follows the beginning. Historians usually separate narratives of one event or series of events from narratives of other events. So we may recount the history of the Union of Parliaments without referring back to Marco Polo's journeys. And we may recount the history of Marco Polo's journeys without going on to the Union of Parliaments. But the narrative of the beginning is not separable. In positing a beginning of all natural things, the ancient narrators trace a sequence that leads from Adam to Abraham and from Abraham to the world they know, connecting their own lives and their ancestors' lives to the original essential enactments of the beginning. So connected to its source, their time could no longer be thought of simply as a refracting lens through which recurrent forms of being and the good were displayed in constant repetition. The originality of time made the good and the real appear more fully. In antiquity, Christians and Jews were troubled by objectors who asked why, if creation was so very good, God did not make it earlier. To which they replied, satisfactorily, if impatiently, that since time itself was created, talk of earlier time had no reference. If you ask when the beginning of a lecture should occur, you can answer after tea or before dinner. But if you ask when the beginning should occur, in the beginning is a complete and total answer. There is no other. Had they been more patient with their objectors, they might have pursued them a little further and pointed out that what scandalized the objectors was not actually the timing of the beginning, but the very idea of a beginning at all. For a beginning must mean that the world is not transcendent over whatever occurs in it, but that an action comes first. The first creation narrative of the book of Genesis relates a series of divine enactments, each in its temporal moment, and God said, each producing new being, and it was so, and each culminating in an acknowledgement of the good. And God saw that it was good. There's no suggestion that the series is governed by a causal or value-driven logic. Good, being, and time are wholly present in each moment. No one of them assumes priority, so that there is no room for the idea of development or continuation within the creation narrative. In the larger narrative of the book of Genesis, of course, there is plenty of development and continuation. The narrative goes on with the expulsion from the garden, the murder of Abel, the calling of Abraham, and so on. But within the narrative itself, there is no development. Everything is beginning. And on the seventh day, it reaches what we may think of as an end of the beginning, which is also the beginning of ends, initiating the possibility of subsequent endings, presiding over ends of weeks, ends of lives, and ends of history. In the beginning, then, is a narrative term of art, but it is not merely a term of art. Narratives always select events to recount. Their beginnings construct the framework that will define the selected story. Beginnings are always elusive and indeterminate, and yet we cannot do without them. Nothing could be more concrete, it would seem, than the Union of Parliaments of 1707. But where does the story begin? With the English Alien Act of 1705, or with the Scottish Act of Security of 1703, with the initiative of William III in 1702, or the death of Prince William of Gloucester in 1700, or even with the Union of the Crowns in 1603, the Treaty of Perpetual Peace in 1502, the Wars of Scottish Independence in the 13th and 14th centuries. They're all perfectly plausible beginnings for that narrative. But the point is, you just have to have one of them. You can't do without a beginning. We do not experience beginnings through the senses, nor do we create images of beginnings in our minds. We intuit them as horizons, before which other things are set in temporal order. All thought of time, even present time, is of this intuited character, stubbornly difficult to cast in empirical or imaginary terms. The absolute beginning is a moment impossible to imagine. We all know that. But then, so is the eternity of the world. And it seems that the two must be exclusive and comprehensive alternatives. So this absolute cleft stick in which our imagination is left simply reflects our general problem with time as such. Belief in creation is an act of faith, not the conclusion of an argument, but it is not a gratuitous act of faith. It's a posit we're invited to make in order to reap all the conceptual benefits of thinking coherently about the time of human action, a time which cannot possibly dispense with either beginnings or endings. If action is to have a secure location in the history of the world, if, that is to say, there is to be a history and not merely time, then the temporal horizons are not dispensable either. Without them, talk of the world and of history fall apart, leaving speculative and practical reason isolated in different universes. One constituted by observable regularities, the other constituted by acts that make no difference to the world. That state of mind, it occurs to me, is unnervingly displayed by all the religious characters in Iris Murdoch's novels, and perhaps was displayed by Iris Murdoch herself. In the second place, then, let us consider the pair good and being. Set over against the priority of God's action, the good of experience appears as creation's inner meaning, the original determinate direction given to the world by God's good deed, disclosed through each event within it. It's often supposed, reasonably plausibly I think, that the Genesis creation narratives were meant as a critique of ancient myths of origin, in which the connection of being and the good was uncertain. There were myths that presented the opposition of the two, as in the slaying of the primeval dragon, where the moral form has to be imposed on chaotic being, so that the good is a late-coming phenomenon of time, necessarily involving violence. And there were also myths of a primeval golden age, an original harmony of good and being, disrupted by the incursion of time and its events. In the one myth, good must be made. In the other, it has been lost. And though we may sometimes need to say either one or the other of these things about particular goods, there is, as the Hebrew creation narrative presents it, a more fundamental assertion to be made first. The good is neither to be made nor to be lost. It is real and present, given once for all in the enactment of being in time. In our first lecture, we discussed the ontological status of the good. The creation narrative approaches this pairing from the other end, from the moral status of the world's being. The enactment of being in time comes to rest in a reflection on its inherent good, and the climax of the narrative sums up the complex whole as very good. Being and good are given together. Just a word about that word given. It's a common enough shorthand for present to experience, and may sometimes carry little or no ontological, moral, or even temporal weight. Anything we experience, from a triangular shape, a musical phrase, a logical entailment, or an earthquake, may be said to be given. But once we speak of the good as given, the expression must have a stronger force. We conceive the good as teleologically structured to an end. Now, that does not imply that every good is consciously intended. Teleology too may have its analogies. Goods may be like ends that agents intend, without being instances of ends that agents intend. But in saying that being and good are given together, we may mean then no more than that the world is universally good in the way that particular parts of it are good. Fruitfulness of trees, the beauty of the sun reflected on waves. If these things please us, we recognize a certain affinity between them and the ends that we propose for ourselves and intend. Yet the analogy need not end there and deserves to be taken further. If we're to enjoy goods and learn to appreciate reflectively what we enjoy, then we need to learn to position ourselves in a certain way towards them. Enjoyment is not automatic. It can be blocked by something within us. A person may have a long face after the very best of good fortune. And the way we position ourselves to enjoyment is as recipients and beneficiaries. Enjoying a good is very like being the object of someone's kindly attention. It has an implicitly dialogical character. We feel addressed, affirmed, invited to respond. A businessman who founded a successful enterprise once wrote, "If I believed in God, I would say thank you." Well as showing a creditable philosophical scrupulousness about not engaging in loose and indeterminate talk of gratitude which has no meaning, this observation also reflects, I think, a certain pathos, as of one wishing to rejoice in good fortune, but lacking the conceptual repertoire necessary for doing so. In his moment of satisfaction, he finds that he has an expectation that is unfulfilled. He hoped, despite himself, that the good he sought and achieved might have been a communication from someone. The immediate expression of an intentionally focused joy is thanksgiving. And if we refuse the implications of that, we have first to teach ourselves to disown our joy, to see through it, as it were, and disembarrass ourselves of all its associations. We may, of course, do that. We can train ourselves not to be spontaneously joyful. But it is painfully deflating from a moral point of view. This brings us to a proposal which is surely worth the rather lumbering journey it has cost us to reach. The idea of the good is bound up with the intuition of a communication. Nothing is good for us unless it is addressed to us. Not necessarily to a particular me, but to an us that I too can identify with. The human race, perhaps, the world of the spirit, the health of the planet, or whatever. And as the language of gifts can very easily dissolve into a minimal language of something given, so the language of good can easily dissolve into a minimal language of subjective demand, the will. And that is the logical inference from Kant's notorious opening claim in The Good Playful, that there is nothing truly good in the world except a good will. For Kant, it remained a question, at least, how the will might be good. But the initial move had destroyed the possibility that there might be other goods than goods of willing. Actions, agents, revelations, and so on and so on. All of which we might welcome without first having had to will them. goods of communication that open our eyes to new and wonderful things. If we think of an original good, we think of a form that has been a gift within the world itself, capable of evoking our thankful response. A recurrent form of nature requires no acceptance and invites no gratitude. Natural form is normative only in the sense that any logical idea is normative, namely as an organization of experience. We're free to be disinterested in an ontological form, for if that form is not addressed to us or to anybody, it does not constitute a reason for us to act. But if a recurrent form is also the communication of an original good, we can recognize, even in the regularities and predictabilities of the natural world, a gift on which the good of our existence depends. And that is a substantive reason for free conformity to the form given. A much better foundation, if I may say so, for ecological concern than any that we normally hear given. Once we think we have grounds to relate our knowledge of being to the conditions of our existence, then we can accept that the good of being is necessarily good for us. Nature requires, one might say, an evangelical content, not natural to it at all, but bearing the promise of an existence in harmony with being. So the conception of creation forges the link between reality and moral existence in a world that is fitted to our agency. In our first lecture, we pointed to the practice of worship as reception of the good. Calvin wrote, "Although our mind cannot conceive of God without rendering some worship to him, it will not be sufficient simply to hold that he is the only being whom all ought to worship and adore, unless we are also persuaded that he is the fount of all goods and that we must seek everything in him." Here we notice an admirable delicacy with which God, as the fount of all goods, is distinguished from his being our good. Talk of goods is not immediately self-referential, but if we learn to seek everything in him, then the fount of all goods becomes the fountain of our goods too. It's possible in principle to wonder at, even to admire, forms of good that present themselves to us as bad for us. Only a true scientist, I suspect, could experience real delight in the coronavirus, with its amazing capacity to reproduce and adapt, quite indifferent to human values. But for our wonder at the world to become worship, we must recognize a good that somehow we can welcome as a communication meant for some us to which we belong. Well, it may be a necessary presupposition of the train of thought we have followed so far that God is to be conceived as the original good. But please notice, we did not begin with the original good. We began with the original action, which implies good. It implies good, but only as bound up in being and time. Moral experience is not simply the experience of gratitude and wonder at the good of being. It's the experience of being acted on and made active, occupying a space within the web of created good, which is suitable for agents. And that is how we derive our normative representations of the good, as ideals, as laws, as goals, and so on, in relation to which we can then regulate our conduct. Within the narrative of creation, the normative character of the whole is presented as a completion, a reflective achievement on the seventh day. It's because creation is finished, an order of things complete and entire, that it affords a direction that gives intelligibility to our action. Good is the real completion of being in time, yet it's open to further realization in reflection and response. These two aspects, good as completion and good as opening, are both present in any adequate account of creation. It remains then to say something about the third pairing, that of time and the good. The idea of time is the idea of a kind of extension and continuity of appearances. Time may sometimes seem to be no more than an empty container for successive appearances, in which case time fulfills the role it plays in the modern idea of nature, that of a refracting lens that displays the recurrent patterns of nature. But as seen through creation, time is the form in which being and the good are necessarily given, in which case we must be able to speak of a fulfillment of time, just as we speak of a fulfillment of being and of good. There is an ontological and axiological plenitude that is realized essentially in time. Only in this way can time be understood as history, a term that fills the idea of time with ontological and axiological weight. Present in reality, a gift once given on which there's no going back, the good still fills time and receives fulfillment through time. And here we may rehabilitate in its proper place the moral ought, which is constituted by measuring the future horizon of action against the reality of the good. The word ought is uttered with full definition and clarity only at the end of a process of reflection and deliberation, as a correlation of real goods and timely opportunities. As we think of time as history, we may think of it as having beginnings, continuations, and ends. A beginning begins nothing without a continuation continues nothing without a beginning. If we say, first there were gases, later there were solids, we're not narrating anything, for there's no beginning, no continuance, no end, merely a sequence of two different appearances. But if we say, out of the gases, solids emerged, we have embarked on narrative. To make good our right to occupy narrative ground, we must show how the gases contained the promise of solids and how the appearance of solids confirmed the direction taken by the gases. The direction is not the beginning, it is a reference from the beginning to something beyond the beginning. A promise proleptically present in the beginning. And that is what is meant by an end in the fullest sense. An end is not a continuation, it's the measure by which a continuation is proved. It is the substance of the promise which directs the continuation. So our grasp of the coherence of history is always proleptic, anticipatory, reaching beyond evidences. We experience time as history in questioning and answering. What have we done? What shall we do? There's no place in history for inferential logic. That is confined to nature. When Barth proposed, as the architecture of his interpretation of creation, that the covenant, that is to say, the history of the relations of God and man, was the inner meaning of creation, and the creation, the outer basis of the covenant, he intended to say that the idea of creation left to rest wholly on its own bottom could never be more than an inconclusive speculation. Its claim to be considered reality is that God has disclosed himself as active in history. The inverse is also true. The experience of history as a meaningful and purposive theatre of action and life will prove illusory unless it is framed within the horizons of a beginning and an end that give it its form. These two ideas are correlative and mutually supportive. Each will collapse without the other. If Hannah Arendt was rightly applauded for stressing the essential role of beginning things for the historicity of human existence, a history that consisted wholly of novelties would not actually be a history at all, because nothing can be begun unless it is somehow binding on the future. And there can be no act that binds the future which is not somehow itself bound by the past, except an original act at the beginning, the act of creation of heaven and earth, which binds everything and is itself unbound. The form of history embodies the tension then between innovation and enduring form in all human action. Well, we've spoken extensively of the divine act, implying the will to perform the act. We've spoken of the direction of history, implying the will to direct that history to an end. There can be no subject for that will apart from God. Approaching God's will at the end of our discussion, and by this roundabout route through creation and history, ensures at least that the phrase, the will of God, has a concrete reference, which is too often lacking when it's used. Everything that God wills, God does. Looking behind the divine act for an anterior will that is not disclosed in the moral direction of history gives rise to many false trails in theology and ethics. Yet, it's inseparable from the very idea of God, that he is before all things. To think of creation as God's act, we must think of God as an agent transcending his act. God in his aseity, in his perfections, a theme much emphasized by the late John Webster to great effect. Does that expose the theologian to the charge of wallowing in metaphysics? Are we simply going back behind everything and explaining everything again? No, not if it's done prudently and comprehensively, imposing no pre-selection of worldly analogies that are supposed to illuminate the divine being more than others are. But if we seize upon the act of will as an analogy uniquely capable of disclosing God's aseity, then we do impose a metaphysical tendency upon our thought of God. If voluntary decision and unconstrained freedom seem to us to be more fundamental than being, goodness, reason, or whatever else we properly attribute to God, then we let ourselves be guided by what we are finding most impressive about ourselves. We reveal the kind of God that we ourselves would secretly like to be. It's often said that modern humanist voluntarism built on the medieval idea of God as absolute will, transferring it from God to the newly divinized man. Well, that may be true, but it's also true that the voluntarist divinity that first came to expression in the Middle Ages, and particularly in the Augustinian strands of it, was already a projection of the human ambition to be unconstrained. Yet abuse of the concept of will does not abolish the proper use of it, and there is an important place for speaking of God's will. The will of God manifest in creation is the vantage point from which the moral meaning of history comes into view. It's not, of course, that ethics can claim any knowledge of its own of the historical facts of God's dealing with the human race. No moral reasoning can prove or disprove the incarnation and resurrection of Christ, for example, or even prove such a highly moralized event as the Babylonian exile of Judah. Nor can moral reasoning declare, on the basis of historical accounts, what the meaning of such events simply must be. To narrate the events of the past as revealing the will of God is the work of prophets, not the work of moralists. What moral reason can do, however, is to recognize the shape of a purposefully formed history when it is shown one. And in the prophetic narratives of history, it can identify the purpose and the promise that it had somehow anyway to assume, which is one reason to support the suggestion I threw out in my first lecture, namely that nowhere more clearly than in ethics do we see precisely what natural theology may be. A history of God's creation invites and validates our action. We must pass beyond awestruck admiration and gratitude for the blessings of creation to confront the tasks of deliberation. The will of God affords us with a ground for the category of law, the normative direction given to practical reason in history. And to this category we turn in our next lecture. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for a profoundly insightful, lucid, and indeed inspiring lecture. We now have some time for Q&A, for which I would ask people to type their questions into the Q&A sidebar. And again, I would also ask that you try to keep your questions concise and to the point. Also, if you're happy to do so, especially if you're known to Professor O'Donovan, please add your name to the question. You may, and you also may indicate any follow-up questions that you might have. And we'll try to address as many questions as time permits. Now, while everyone is gathering their thoughts, let me begin by asking a first question. Okay, so I imagine that I might not be the only one to reflect on what might be missing from your opening 3 lectures on what is missing. And I think the thought that came to my mind was that one potentially missing lecture was one on the missing place on the land. Now, obviously, there are going to be limitations as to what you're able to cover, but I would be very interested to hear whether or not you think this might be a missing piece, especially since so many of our ethical discussions today are bound up with land and place. And one of the reasons I think for asking this question just now is that this issue seems to be particularly pertinent when thinking about creation and covenant. When we think about the covenant history of Israel, for example, this seems to be much more concerned about the gift of a place, a promised land that is for history, rather than simply being concerned about the time of history.
I think I want to say that there are a large number of things that can go missing in ethics at the secondary level. Very noticeably in the history of ethics, the body has often gone missing. And place is essentially bodily. It's a context of bodily existence, a condition in which bodies relate to bodies and form communities. And the missing character of place, about which I fully agree, is an aspect of a tendency of ethics sometimes to become disembodied, which can happen. Ethics can also sometimes become too embodied. It can forget other things in action, such as will. These particular topics which go missing come after, in my view, the three fundamental missing elements that I identified, being time and agency. And about those, I would want to say, there can be no ethics of anything in the end. No ethics of any kind if we let those go missing. If we let place go missing, there will be ethics of a kind, an ethics of inner reflection, of motivation, of an ethics bordering on spirituality in various forms, which tends to overlook and ignore the full reality of our bodily interactions.
Great. Well, thank you for that wonderful answer. So moving on to our next question. So could you reflect on the significance of the Sabbath in illuminating the nature of creation, time, and the good? Also, does the fall occlude the goodness of creation and or our perception of the good?
I would have liked to have said a little bit more about the Sabbath, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so. I think you will have picked up from what I said about it that what I don't see it as being is a kind of narrative conclusion or narrative climax of the 6 days of creation, that it brings things to a kind of head. That if there were a climax, if we're correct to see a climax at all, it would be on the 6th day, with the creation of human being. I incline to see, to downplay actually the whole structured order in this repeated 7-day pattern in the narrative, in favor of seeing the repetition as a kind of constant regularity that applies to every kind of being equally. But that's perhaps wrong. Exegetes could easily quarrel with me over that. The Sabbath is a reflective moment. It's the moment when the totality of what has been detailed in the 6 days is brought together and seen in its totality as a whole. And that is what I meant by saying that I think the Sabbath that gives direction. It is what allows history to take a direction, because it is offering you a form of creation, a total picture of what God has done, which is not just noticing one thing and failing to note another thing. It invites you to relate yourself to that form as a whole, hence its significance as anticipating the end, which is fulfillment. Does the fall occlude? Yes, of course it does. Occlude is actually a very good verb, because occlude means hide from sight, conceal from observation, distract one's attention from, basically making something that is inaccessible to us. And one of the most obvious results of the fall is the difficulty we have in conceiving the good in all its rounded created goodness. The very tendency of moral enthusiasm now to chase one thing, now to chase another thing, is, a year ago, all our moral enthusiasm was about destroying the coronavirus. Today, all our moral enthusiasm is about encouraging biodiversity again, as we were the year before last. The incoherence of our grasp of the pattern is painfully obvious in all moral seriousness. I'm not talking about trivial people having trivial thoughts here. I'm talking about our most serious moral ideas, how one-sided and unbalanced they tend to become. And that's part of the history of ethics, I think. And that is obviously one way in which one might see the fall operative in our knowledge of the good.
Great, thank you. So we now have a question from Stephanie Redfern-Jones. So she asks, what place would you give to Ignatian spirituality in relation to creation? And by Ignatian spirituality, she means that we can find God in all things and that we are contemplatives in action.
This is a complex question, and to answer it well would require a deeper knowledge of Ignatian, St. Ignatius than I have. And I think I'd better say that at the beginning. So I answer from the superficiality of my understanding of the project, which is a focusing project, as I understand it. It's teaching a certain kind of focus, and particularly a certain kind of focus on our agency and on our capacity to decide. And this, it seems to me, is important to Ignatian spirituality. And therefore, I would see it as, one might say, an important chapter in moral theory that has got this particular problem. How do I weigh things up? How do I take things in? How do I reach a decision to act out of them? That takes that as a matter of special scrutiny and teaches us disciplines to try and approach it. I mean, there must be many more things to be said about the tradition than that. That is the one that strikes me first, and as such, one might say it lies at the basis of all responsible, rather serious casuistry, for which there has to be a place in moral reasoning. It was the Jesuits, taught by St. Ignatius, who developed casuistry in ways that sometimes were extremely successful and sometimes gave a lot of problems, but that's inevitable. It was an important development.
Great, thank you. Now we have another question here from Ruan Bassa in Grand Rapids in Michigan. And it said that you argued that the idea of the good is bound up with the intuition of a communication. Now, if we accept Augustine's description of evil as a privation of the good, how does evil relate to that intuition of a communication, since our experience of the good relates somehow to evil?
I take it that our experience of evil, first of all, is an experience of an inaccessibility of the good, an incapacity to recognize a good that may be present in a given situation. The primordial experience of evil, one might say, is the experience of being hurt, in which all the horizons of hope and faith and the sense of the trustworthy order of the world in which we live suddenly close down. And that there is, as it were, an experience of communication totally removed. And we find ourselves in our suffering, enclosed in ourselves. I think, therefore, that our experience of evil is that of an interruption of communication on which we count and perhaps don't recognize and perhaps don't reflect and perhaps are not grateful for, but all the time we're just assuming, going along, the world will do what the world does until it stops, and then it doesn't anymore, and that whole experience is interrupted. And from the interruption, we can learn what it was that we were assuming. And we come to recognize what a good really is. That's a very rough approach to a rather certain question that I would like to think a lot more about before I said more.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is from someone anonymous. So they ask, so one suspects that Augustine would not have been able to resist finding a Trinitarian significance in the group being good time. Are you yourself tempted to explore a significance of this kind?
Well, first of all, I just have to exculpate Augustine from that terrible slander that he was, as it were, attracted to his Trinitarian model by a kind of irresistible urge and thirst for three patterns of three. I mean, I think there are patterns of three. Augustine was very selective about the patterns of three he chose, and was rather contemptuous of some of those on offer in the theological discourse of his day, and said they weren't good at all. And so I suppose I'm inclined, while acknowledging the tempting nature of the, you know, the three-leaf shamrock idea that operates a great deal in much of our thinking and sometimes has to be overcome. I'm not prepared to rest much on that. It so happens that I've employed this this triad at this point, and think it very essential, but it is essentially a pattern of creation. And before we take all the patterns in creation and say, God's just, I think we need somehow to pause and reflect on what changes one might need to make to those patterns before one can talk intelligibly about God through them. So that's just a holding operation in the face of a rather stimulating question.
Great, thank you. So we have a question now from Robin Foray. So it would seem that evolution returned some account of history into nature, although without a defined end, crucially. Do you see this as related to the return in some ways, to seeing nature as making moral claims on us in ecological and other ethics, as you mentioned at the beginning of the lecture?
I think there's, of course, a very good and worthwhile observation to start from. Of the many people who were shocked when, as it were, the doctrines of evolution that were not actually new in the middle of the 19th century, but had been going around under the surface for a little while, broke cover and took on high scientific pretensions. Some were shocked because of the damage to faith, others were shocked because of the damage to science and scientific method, and saw the tendency to find teleology in nature, an ongoing univocal historical development within nature, dangerous, unscientific, simply. And I think in an important sense, that's right. Evolution as a rounded, completed doctrine, a doctrine of how the world has grown, a sort of biohistory, a doctrine of biohistory, is more than a doctrine formed from scientific observation. It's scientific observation, carefully carried out, fitted into a philosophical framework. And the philosophical framework was, of course, part of what appealed to people who weren't going to linger very long on the scientific observations that fed it. So at this point, you can really see a philosophy of history and a new set of scientific investigations just merging with one another and forging a kind of unified approach for a while. And that's a very interesting bit of scientific and philosophical history that did and could happen. That's just an observation on Robin's starting point, and I'm afraid I got so enthusiastic about that could you just repeat what the question was at the end?
Yes, of course. Okay, so do you see this as related to the return in some ways to seeing nature as making a moral claim on us in ecological and other ethics, as you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture?
Yes, of course, I do. The difficulty is, of course, that an evolutionary conception of history lacks an eschatology, unless it's a purely ideal eschatology. Therefore, it's always shadowed by the possibility of devolution. The whole process going into reverse and everything simplifying again. Human beings disappear from the surface of the earth and viruses take over and so on. I mean, that's always a possibility in principle that the evolutionary view of history has to encompass. It therefore does not get all the way to the kind of moral faith that a concept of the normativity of nature really has. If this process is to go into reverse, if this planet is to die, we have no scientific reasons to object to it. We're going to have to look for our reasons from somewhere else. And in fact, I think the real sources of the concern for the planet are either simply utilitarian, human-related questions. If there's a universe without a human environment, may be a very splendid thing, but it's not very convenient for us. We have to do what we can to preserve the human environment. That is one reason. The other is, I think, a recapitulation of the romantic conception of nature, in which, in the end, there is an immanent purpose, a kind of divinity within nature. God and nature are in moving in this direction and not moving in that direction. For such a faith, the total collapse of life on this planet would be a disproof of faith in a way I think it's not for any scientific doctrine.
Great, thank you. So we have a small question of clarification here, with someone asking whether you could say something about the difference and relation between time and history.
Yes. Time is empty, history is full. Time crawls by and history drives forward with a purpose. History is formed time, I think is the way I want to put it. It is the form of time in an important sense. At least to believe in history is to believe that it is. We may refuse to believe in history. It's actually perfectly possible, in which case we have no reason to look for meaning in events, but people can live without looking for meaning in events. But if we believe in history, we believe that it is a form that is given to time, which therefore shapes time to some kind of plenitude or fulfillment. Now, does that account for what historians do when they claim to do history? Well, in an important sense, it does, because to impose an intelligibility on any episode of the past, go back to the Union of Parliaments, to write a history of the Union of Parliaments, as I say, you really have to make sense of it. There has to be a shift. You may start in the 14th century with the Wars of Independence, or you may start in 1700 with King William, with the death of Prince William of Gloucester. It doesn't matter, but one way or the other, a shape has got to emerge from it. You are recounting a narrative that takes a certain form and reaches a certain point. So that you can say, when the union is finally in place and the Scottish MPs are all down in Westminster, you can say, and there we are, it had arrived. It had happened. And such a form is necessary, I think, to the historical narrative task, because it's necessary to narration. What the historians don't have to sign up to if they don't want to is the philosophical notion of a history of history.
Great, thank you. So we have someone asking whether you might be able to say a little bit about how you locate your work historiographically. So there are clearly some classical elements that you wish to recover, but you have also indicated a desire to take Kant seriously as a starting point of modern thought, rather than proceeding to depict modernity as a kind of mistake that is best brushed aside. So how are you inclined to situate your thinking, or how do you think about your approach in the context of history?
I think about ethics as a Christian theologian committed in some important way to the Christian understanding of history. And this has two implications, I think. One is that the Christ event is a moment of disclosure in history that is unique and reveals the shape of history in an important sense, that the kingdom of God is the biblical way of putting it, one might say. And the other is that there is fulfillment still to come. I therefore rule out from myself, I debar myself from a purely ahistorical discussion of interesting texts. It's sometimes been an ambition of some philosophers to read great philosophical texts with an almost deliberate timelessness, to say, well, here are 5 propositions to be found in Plato's Timaeus. How can we argue? How can we discuss them? And to treat them as absolutely synchronous with ourselves, as though Plato were not history. I don't want to read historical texts in that way. I think being brought up reading the Bible forbids me to dehistoricize in an important way. In this corrects certain approaches to reading of historical philosophical texts and corrects certain approach to reading historical biblical texts. At the same time, I cannot say that simply that everything that one can learn from, though giving a priority and a normative status to testimony surrounding a selective part of history in which the great disclosure occurs, I cannot, anything from outside that is of no interest. And above all, I cannot say, I think, what a lot of modernity criticism sometimes is tempted into saying, namely that the last good thought was probably had by Thomas Aquinas, shall we say, before the evils of Scotus came along, followed by the ghastliness of the Reformation, and then Kant, and now goodness knows who. I'm just not able to divide history that way. I don't think it's right. And I therefore approach a figure like Kant, obviously very determinative of the modern tradition, as expecting to find in him certain brilliant clarities of disclosure which I can learn from, certain blindnesses. And in him particularly, but he's a very great mind, I think one can see both those things and see them remarkably clearly. And so the task for humble works after Kant, those who would write ethics today, is to digest and to sift, to try to take on all that is extremely valuable that has been thrown up, and at the same time to overcome those blindnesses that certainly do operate within large sections of the modern tradition, has been very one-sided in certain ways. The modern tradition has all been formed, one wants to say, by the success of science, and the sorts of materialism that have come, certain things that are not going to be well understood by it, which nevertheless it talks about and one can learn from how it talks about it. So that very sort of attempt to keep an open, receptive while critical mind is the best that I can make modern writers.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm afraid that our time has now come to an end, but I would like to say a big thank you to all the questions, which I think have generated a very fruitful conversation. And let me also say again, a huge thanks to Professor O'Donovan for what has been a superb lecture. And I'm sure that I express the view of everyone when I say that we are very much looking forward to the final 2 lectures next week. Thank you.